Hello chums, and welcome to Tuning for Beginners, the series where I'll be covering every aspect of tuning and tweaking in Gran Turismo 7 to help those who are struggling. This series is aimed at road cars, since they are affected much more than race cars by changes to tuning. It's worth mentioning that my advice here will hopefully help you with consistency, but not necessarily with speed, so if you're chasing the last few tenths of a second at Sardinia to make grinding more efficient, I'm afraid this series probably won't help you. Now let's begin. Today's video will focus on how to set up four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive cars. Originally making their name on the rally stages, the technology trickled down to road cars and has become almost ubiquitous today in any car that has any inclination towards performance, to the point that even the current BMW M3 has all-wheel drive. In Gran Turismo 7, we can further split this drivetrain into two groups. The first group is all-wheel drive cars that have their engines in the front. This is your typical Imprezas, Evos and GTRs. The second group is those with a mid or rear engined layout, which will cover all of the modern Lamborghinis, Bugattis, Audi R8s and the newly added Porsche 911 Turbo. While the basics are similar, there are some key differences with how to set up each group. I will focus on front-engined cars first, using an R33 GTR as the example because it sounds excellent. With four-wheel drive cars, you typically get two main characteristics. The first is obviously the extra traction out of corners afforded by the all-wheel drive system, which can sometimes lead to understeer. However, in some particularly powerful front-engined examples, power oversteer can happen. The other characteristic is oversteer when braking. So in the case of front-engine cars, we ideally want to reduce oversteer when braking so that the car is more stable. We also want to prevent the car from oversteering when powering out of a corner, but we don't want the car to understeer because then we can't use the car's main advantage of traction. I'll start off by setting this car up for maximum attack on racing soft tyres. As usual, a high natural frequency is ideal when using racing tyres, since this will reduce body roll and make the car feel more controlled. Setting it higher at the rear can also reduce braking oversteer. A high anti-roll bar setting will have a similar effect, but if we increase it more at the rear, it can also reduce the braking oversteer. Meanwhile, for body height, if the car is lower, it will be more agile, but also more unsettled when driving over curbs or bumps, and if it's too low, it can be prone to wheel arch rubbing on particularly violent compressions, which can wrench the steering. Too high and the car will be less nimble, and on racing tyres, possibly even prone to rolling over. I typically run my cars roughly 10 to 20mm above the minimum. In this car, I've prioritised my OCD however, because if you set the ride height even, the car looks lower at the rear, so the front ride height is at the minimum, and the rear ride height is about 20mm higher. I don't typically see much difference with compression and expansion, other than low values can make the car bouncier over curbs, so I typically have them set somewhere in the middle. Camber usually benefits from being somewhere around 2 degrees. Too low and the car's handling suffers. Too high and the car's braking can suffer. Setting camber slightly lower at the rear can also reduce oversteer when braking, whilst improving the car's ability to turn into a corner. Toe angle is down to personal preference. Front toe out can help reduce the lift-off oversteer, and front toe in can increase it. I typically leave it at 0 for most of the front-engined cars. Rear toe out can increase power oversteer, or in the case of a four-wheel drive, help pull the car around corners for better exit speeds. Rear toe in typically isn't helpful as it can increase power understeer. I would recommend the rear toe at 0 or up to 0.3 toe out. Differential settings can often be the most transformative. Initial torque, especially at the front, can alter the way a car turns in. Low values mean better agility, high values mean the car is more controlled but harder to turn. I've found that maxing the front and reducing the rear can help with the braking oversteer whilst not creating too much in the way of understeer. It's a good compromise. Acceleration sensitivity dictates where the power is sent from one side to the other. High values send more power to the outside wheel, encouraging oversteer. Low values send more to the inside, creating understeer. Higher values at the rear versus the front will encourage more oversteer. I would recommend keeping both values around 40 to 50. In particularly powerful cars like the R35 when fully upgraded, higher values at the front can make the car feel more controllable. Braking sensitivity doesn't make as much difference as you might expect. Lower values improve turn-in and brake feel. Higher values are supposed to make the car more controllable under braking at the expense of some braking performance. However, I've not found much difference in my testing, so I typically keep the values low. The torque vectoring dictates how much power is sent to the front or the rear. In the majority of front-engine cars, I have it set to 45-55 for maximum traction. Downforce depends on the car. Like most, having the front roughly 100 points lower than the rear will keep the car stable for most applications. If your car has 400 horsepower or less, you can probably reduce that difference to around 50 points, either to increase the front downforce or to reduce the rear downforce, thus increasing your top speed. The Lancia Delta on its stock engine, for example, can be driven fairly safely with its maximum downforce of 200 at the front and 250 at the rear. However, the same car with the R35 engine and 1000 horsepower will be less stable due to the speeds it can reach, so front downforce ideally needs to be reduced. When it comes to ballast, there's almost no situation where a front-engined four-wheel drive car is faster with more weight added, unlike front or rear-wheel drive cars. For transmission, I recommend watching my dedicated video, which will explain everything much better than I can in a few seconds here. So, we've set the car up for full tilt. Now let's set the car up for the 700 performance point Le Mans race. As usual, fitting racing hard tyres will take away a few points whilst lasting longer for the tyre wear. A lot of four-wheel drives are turbocharged from the factory, so they'll have the option of anti-lag, which I recommend switching off due to increased fuel usage. Next up, reducing front downforce will reduce the performance rating without necessarily taking away too much actual performance. This allows you to keep more power, which is worth it despite the understeer that this will introduce. Adding ballast weight to get closer to a 50-50 weight distribution will also generally benefit you more than taking power away, especially on the De La Salle circuit. All that's left is to limit power. Using the ECU takes away more torque than the power restrictor, which lets you run higher horsepower numbers at the same performance point rating. Since the car is still on racing tyres, no changes have to be made to the suspension or the differential. When setting up for 600 performance points, it's much the same principle, though I would change to sports hard tyres which suit the miserable Tokyo Expressway race. While you don't have to change the suspension, I would recommend reducing natural frequency and increasing body height, since the extra body roll can actually make the car feel like it has more grip. So, that's a front-engined car. What if you have a death wish? Here is an Audi R8 V10, and it's fairly well known for being quite terrifying when fully upgraded, along with the majority of mid or rear engine four-wheel drive cars. They have similar characteristics to the front engine cars, but everything is dialed up to 11. The oversteer when braking is much more perilous, and due to a lack of weight over the front axle, they are more prone to understeer when accelerating out of a corner. So, when setting up these cars, there's a few small changes. Most of the same rules apply for the body height, anti-roll bars, dampers, frequency, and camber. However, I recommend the front toe angle be adjusted. A toe out setting at the front will help prevent lift-off oversteer. The initial torque settings will go a long way to help iron out the oversteer too. Increasing the rear initial torque can also help slightly on particularly unruly cars. The torque vectoring differential is usually something I adjust slightly differently on mid or rear engine cars too, sending more power to the rear compared to when using front engine cars. With downforce, once again you ideally want the rear at least 100 points higher than the front, if not more. In some cases the front downforce may have to be reduced to increase stability. There are some cars where all of the above isn't enough. I'm looking at you, Porsche 959. In cars like this, ballast weight is your last resort. Adding weight to the front axle, even if only a small amount like 40 kilograms, will vastly improve the car's manners, and in some cases, it will make the car faster overall. The Porsche 959 and Lamborghini Gallardo are two examples of this. Tuning a car like this for performance point limit is much the same as with the front-engined examples. Reduce front downforce, add ballast for a 50-50 weight distribution, and in the case of the Audi, removing the turbo will reduce the torque and give the car a much more linear spread of power. From there you can limit the ECU and the power restrictor if necessary. So, to conclude, the things that have the biggest overall effect on your four-wheel drive are initial torque and toe angle. Initial torque can be maxed at the front and set to the minimum at the rear to reduce braking oversteer that plagues so many of these cars. Meanwhile, some rear toe out can be used to help these cars pull themselves out of corners for great exit speeds. Beyond that, many of the settings that apply to front-engine rear-wheel drive cars will still apply fairly well to front and mid-engine four-wheel drive cars, other than some of those mid-engine cars needing ballast to improve their manners. So, I think I've covered most of what you need to set up your four-wheel drive / all-wheel drive cars. If there's any outliers you can think of where my recommended settings don't help, please let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to respond with a quick tune that will hopefully improve it. Join me next time where I'll cover mid and rear engine rear-wheel drive cars. Thank you very much for watching, and if this helps you, I'd be very grateful for your subscription. Take care of yourself, and ta-ra.